Hello everyone, the point of this video is to give you some insight into how you can analyze visual language in your language analysis. So the purpose of visual language is that it presents the point of view about an issue in a visual rather than a written manner. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about things like cartoons, photographs, illustrations, posters, etc. Maybe even graphs or visual ways of showing statistics. Could be a whole lot of different things. These images are meant to usually complement or support or add an extra layer to the written text. You should be fairly familiar with this idea of analyzing visual language because you've done this in film studies, you've done this in history, so you should have some experience and skills that you can carry over from what you've learned in those situations. One thing that you need to keep in mind is that you need to treat every aspect of an image as deliberately constructed. So in your SAC and your exam, you'll receive a written article, or rather a written text, and an accompanying image which will complement an argument, claim, or point in the written text. You'll need to analyze the image and discuss its connection to the written text. So you're not supposed to just talk about the image in isolation, but you're meant to be able to describe how it's connected to perhaps the contention that the author is trying to get across in the written text, or perhaps the image is related to a really specific argument or point that is made in the written text. You've got to describe that connection. So showing the relationship between the two is key. So here's an example. I'm not going to read it out. You can pause the video here if you would like to read it. I'd advise reading it over at least once so that you can understand the connection between the written text and the photograph. So the photograph itself is a visual way of depicting or portraying the person that is described in the written text. So these two parts of the text itself are meant to complement one another. Now, what are the connections? Well, obviously it shows the model that is being described. It shows the model herself, and you might state that the dark background of the photograph brings our focus specifically on the model. It draws our attention to her, it draws our attention to just how skinny she actually is. So if you've read the text, you'll know that the author is trying to create a sense of horror, a sense of disgust even, that models are allowed to be this skinny, and provides a visual way of reinforcing that. Now, if I were to discuss this in a paragraph, I probably wouldn't have one whole paragraph devoted to the photograph itself, because there just isn't enough to discuss there to warrant a whole paragraph. I would probably try to analyze the written text on the left, discuss how the author intends to position the audience, and then I would tag an analysis of the photograph onto the end of that paragraph. Okay, onto the end of that body paragraph that shows the connection between the photograph and the written text, and also just quickly describes the features of that photograph and analyzes how the audience is intended to be positioned. Now, if you've got something like this, which is a cartoon about parents who attend their children's sports games, and those angry parents who get really into it and probably go over the top, they're described by the written text that this relates to as toxic parents. If you look at this, there are lots of different elements that you could talk about. You could talk about the parent that's depicted as a donkey or an ass. Okay, you could talk about his or her t-shirt. You could talk about the symbols around its mouth, which I think are meant to symbolize profanity. You could talk about the flies flying around its butt, which probably accentuate this idea that people are disgusted by this donkey. You could talk about the facial expressions of the people in the crowd. You could discuss the speech bubble. You could also talk about the referee's expression, and also the little girl's expression, the little girl wearing 17 who is very likely the ass's daughter. Okay, so there are lots of different elements that you could discuss and describe in this cartoon. Right, lots of different ways that the author, or the cartoonist in this case specifically, is trying to position the audience to believe a certain point of view. So I would say something like this. If you were to get something like this, you would have to devote a whole paragraph to this because there's just so much that you could discuss. So aside from that, what are some elements of a visual text that you might want to look out for? Well, you could think about where it's positioned. Is it at the start? If it was at the start of a particular text, whether it's a speech, whether it's a presentation, whether it's an article, perhaps that's the first thing that the audience is supposed to interact with. Okay? If it's next to a certain kind of, if it's next to a certain text, if it's next to a certain argument or claim, perhaps it relates to that claim, and similar to what we looked at before, maybe it's trying to reinforce something really directly. Maybe it's at the end. You might want to think about the size of the different elements in there, the style that the content is presented in, what's in the foreground and the background. Is there any contrast or juxtaposition? Are things placed next to one another so that you see the differences and the similarities? Are there symbols, and perhaps are there colors that you can describe? So these are examples of the kinds of texts, visual texts or visual elements that you might get. For example, this is a poster. I would advise you to pause the video at some points and think about what is the creator of these images. What are they trying to get across to the audience, and how are they trying to do that? Okay, so let's talk about paragraph writing, and I've already alluded to this before. So if you're writing a paragraph focusing on the accompanying image itself, then I would advise you to have a topic sentence that introduces the type of image and its connection with the written text. So for example, if we look back at the photograph of the model, you might say that the author has included a photograph of a model in order to reinforce the horror and disgust that the audience is meant to feel from reading the written text. Okay, just a quick little topic sentence there. Now you need to describe the different elements of it in detail. So again, if we look back at this, you might talk about the model herself, how she's positioned in the middle of the photograph, and you might also talk about how the dark background brings our focus specifically on the model. However, if you're looking at something like this, right, you have a whole lot of different elements that you could talk about. Don't forget that the most important part is not just describing what the image looks like, but you need to explain how the audience is intended to be positioned. So for example, if you were looking at this, you might want to point out that the parent is portrayed as a donkey or an ass. The intention behind this being that the audience is meant to believe or think that these parents are making fools of themselves, because an ass is typically considered a foolish animal. Another element, you might look at the facial expressions of some of the crowd, and you can see that they look angry or frustrated or disgusted. This is intended to show how others view these parents with disgust or with anger. Now, if you're tagging your analysis of the image onto an existing paragraph about an argument or a claim in the written text, then you don't need a topic sentence, but you should still state the connection between the image and the written text. Okay, and the rest is pretty much the same. Describe the different elements of it in detail and explain how the audience is intended to be positioned. So I hope that's useful, because you are going to receive a text with an image or images that you will need to analyze.